I'm sure most people watching this video have at some point in their lives wondered, how do all these models, actors, and Baywatch bikini girls get in such incredible shape for their roles? In fact, I distinctly remember watching this interview when the Tarzan movie was just released, and this is what Alexander Skarsgård had to say about his diet.
It was about 9 months of chicken breast and broccoli.
But rarely do you ever see someone talking about the answer for fast fat loss being dessert. The idea, as you expect, sounds completely absurd, but why is that? The obvious thing most people point out after hearing that question is, desserts tend to be high in carbohydrates and refined sugar. After all, that's what makes us fat, right?
Is butter a carb? Yes.
It's true that sugar, which deserves a video by itself by the way, has some inherent and interesting physiological effects worth discussing. So while it can definitely be part of the problem, it's actually not a complete analysis of the bigger picture. The bigger picture requires us to look at total energy balance or calorie intake versus expenditure. It's the way we quantify how much food we're eating compared to how much energy we're using for day-to-day function. Take a look at this year-long randomized controlled clinical trial with 609 participants. The researchers split participants into two groups. One followed a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, whilst the other group followed a low fat, high carbohydrate diet. Despite the high carbohydrate group consuming almost twice the amount of added sugars, when total energy intake was matched, the difference in fat loss between the two over an entire year was only 1.5 pounds, neither statistically significant nor clinically relevant. However, the correct interpretation of this research is not that sugar consumption does not matter at all. It's simply to illustrate that, hypothetically, if we were to track all your calories by weighing out every single bit of food you eat, you could, in theory, lose weight on a diet consisting of nothing but donuts, cake, and ice cream. This would tackle the problem of having to consume bland foods such as chicken and broccoli, but it also creates a few very obvious problems. Firstly, desserts don't usually contain any vegetables or animal organs, so naturally they won't be very dense in micronutrients. For the average individual who has a maintenance of 2,000 calories, if you look at this 1,700 calorie diet I constructed consisting entirely of desserts, we quickly notice how it falls short in almost every essential vitamin or mineral necessary for good health. Secondly, even if we were to cover all of our micronutrient requirements through effective supplementation, there is still the issue of tracking. We have to literally weigh out every bit of food we eat for as long as we wish to lose or maintain our current weight. This means no more eating out at restaurants or any food where nutritional information is not available.
Oh, I'll just have a side salad.
We have no side salad.
Back to the car.
If we don't track food meticulously like this, we would lose our advantage of being able to objectively quantify how much energy we are consuming. We now go back to relying on subjective hunger cues, which is how people normally eat. To gain some insight regarding what could happen when our dessert-only diet is practiced under those circumstances, we can take a look at this 2018 clinical trial involving 214 subjects. The study investigated ad libitum energy intake, which meant subjects were allowed to eat as much or as little food as they wanted to by accessing a vending machine created by the researcher. The results showed that consumption of foods high in fats and simple sugars was associated with and actually predicted overeating and weight gain. This is hardly surprising, considering that foods high in simple sugars are generally highly palatable. An example of this is how you probably remember how impossibly difficult it is to just eat one M&M. Usually you end up eating the whole packet. Take a look at this comparison of food volume between different foods when we match for the number of calories they have. It's mostly true that all of these foods, when consumed in the displayed amounts, will be equally as fattening. However, the difference is with celery, you are able to consume countless piles, whereas the dessert you would only be able to nibble on a handful of gummy bears or a pathetically small bar of chocolate. So far, it doesn't really seem like good news for us over here at Team Dessert, but despite all this, I am still unyielding in my statement that dessert is absolutely not mutually exclusive with weight loss. There's absolutely a calculated formula of centering your nutritional approach around your favorite desserts. It's not just some cheap trick or quick fix, and it works by marrying many of the scientific principles we've discussed earlier. The first thing we can use to our advantage is non-nutritive sweeteners. Non-nutritive sweeteners are usually artificial sweeteners, and they allow us to significantly reduce the number of calories in any given number of desserts or beverages, without compromising on taste, something that simply removing all the sugar would not do. Despite this, the term artificial sweeteners usually leaves a bitter taste in the mouth for many people. This is likely the result of a couple factors, one being the word artificial and its tendency to draw upon the appeal to nature fallacy. For those who've watched my previous video, you'll understand why this argument of something being unnatural, so therefore supposedly bad for you, is a fundamentally flawed and intellectually inconsistent argument. But regardless, people are usually skeptical about the effectiveness and safety of non-nutritive sweeteners, citing literature similar to this 2017 meta-analysis and systematic review. And at the end, they conclude that consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners was not generally associated with weight loss amongst participants in randomized controlled clinical trials, except in the long-term trials with industry sponsorship. On the surface level, this sounds very discouraging. But before we jump to any conclusions ourselves, why don't we actually look at those studies that they're talking about? These are the 7 randomized controlled clinical trials that the researchers looked at. I want to bring your attention to 2 of these studies which the researchers noted had either unclear or low risk of bias. So presumably at least one of them is mostly free from any conflicts of interest. They're supposed to juxtapose the 5 other studies which on average did see improvements, but came with the problem being that they had what the researchers deemed to be a high risk of bias. Now the knee-jerk reaction to this scenario is that Big Sweetener is funding the studies and blinding us from the truth. However, those 2 studies not in support of reducing body weight had study designs that weren't actually supposed to induce a reduction in body weight. Let me explain what this means. They split subjects with mild hypertension into 2 groups, stevioside capsules and placebo, and then look at what effect there would be on blood pressure. They weren't trying to look at whether or not it would help them lose weight. Secondly, even if researchers were trying to investigate the effect of these sweeteners on weight loss, this study design completely fails to leverage the usefulness of non-nutritive sweeteners, which is to provide subjects a way of enjoying desserts without overshooting their caloric intake goals, thereby letting them eat more food they enjoy and more food in total, thus improving dietary adherence. Instead, how this study went about administering the sweetener was not with food, but with capsules, which was perfectly fine for investigating its effects on blood pressure, but would have been a major misapplication of non-nutritive sweeteners had the goal been to improve weight loss outcomes. Now, unfortunately, we only have time in this video to analyze one of these studies which did show an improvement in weight loss outcomes. 303 subjects were split into a sweetened beverage and water group. Both of them were instructed to consume at least 710 milliliters of their assigned liquid every single day. The 2 groups also received an identical weight loss and maintenance protocol involving exercise and advice from registered dietitians. The whole study went on for around 52 weeks, and subjects in the sweetened beverage group lost an average of around 5 kilograms or 11 pounds more than the water group. Imagine how we could leverage this if we didn't limit ourselves solely to beverages and started incorporating this concept into actual desserts too. But before we do that, I want to point out why I think the researchers of the meta-analysis proposed that this paper had a high risk of bias. It was funded by the American Beverage Association, which definitely rings alarm bells. I think this is largely because of the viral article repeatedly reposted by everyone who seeks to dismiss all industry-funded research. The difference between this particular paper and the scandal which happened in the 1960s was that this paper had 11 authors, with only 2 of them being in any other way associated with a beverage company. Had they gone into this study with dishonest intentions, they would have been vastly outnumbered by their 9 other colleagues. By contrast, the 1960s review paper only had 3 authors, all 3 of which received money directly from the Sugar Research Foundation. Additionally, the studies in the 1960s paper were handpicked by the Sugar Research Foundation themselves, something which is problematic for obvious reasons. For this particular 2016 paper, however, not only did the American Beverage Association have no say in how the researchers were allowed to design the study or write the manuscript, there was even a third-party organization who investigated the data to guarantee accuracy and integrity. So while it is extremely important to be mindful of industry-funded research, the situations I've compared here have some equally extreme differences in their context. If the 2 hypertension studies I mentioned which showed no adverse effects still don't float your boat, or have concerns regarding the impacts of sweeteners on things like gut health, we need to understand that only saccharin and sucralose have been shown to shift populations of gut microbiota, and in ways that are not necessarily proven to be negative or positive. Furthermore, even if we were certain that they impacted our gut health, and in a way that negatively impacted our overall health, any negative effect that exists has failed to unveil itself in the form of adverse effects, suggesting that the magnitude of these effects, if they even exist, are highly likely to be tiny and unworthy of consideration. Compare this with the effects of sweeteners on weight loss we've mentioned earlier. Now that we've hopefully gained an appreciation for the usefulness of non-nutritive sweeteners in creating fat loss compatible desserts, why don't we explore some of the other tools we can use to propel our progress? We know that despite issues regarding palatability finally being mitigated thanks to the help of sweeteners, hunger and satiety were also key issues previously mentioned. The first strategy is the use of pre-meal water consumption. 3 randomized controlled clinical trials have shown its effectiveness in reducing voluntary food consumption and weight loss. All 3 studies followed a similar model where participants would consume some water, around 500 milliliters or 16 ounces before their meal. A very simple but still helpful concept that has proved to be an effective intervention. The second strategy is to increase your fiber intake through fruits or invest a little money in fiber supplementation like inulin and add them to your favorite baking recipe or dessert. Take a look at this study which showed how increasing fiber intake led to less food consumed, which is good because for us that means you'll end up eating naturally smaller portions and less of your already low-calorie dessert without compromising your enjoyment. So then, as a closing summary, how can we incorporate all these scientific strategies together? Well, there are already thousands of sugar-free or low-calorie recipes that are only a Google search away. So you could explore and find which desserts you really like to eat and which recipes you seem to enjoy. Now, of course, I understand that not everyone has the time to cook or bake their own low-calorie desserts using non-nutritive sweeteners. To compensate for that, perhaps next time you go shopping for groceries, you could consider picking an artificially sweetened and lower calorie variant of your favorite snack. This will usually be a step in the right direction for most people's weight loss goals, and honestly, this could even be something as simple as picking a 0-calorie syrup for your pancakes. You can also combine this with the easy but highly effective satiety strategies we discussed earlier. A large glass of water and a banana a few minutes before your pancakes doesn't take a lot of effort to implement, but could potentially go a long way for making you feel fuller and eating less. These are all just tools in your arsenal which you can use independently as tips and tricks, or all together as an entire system.